Hey everyone, Janessa here from the blog almostheavenhomesteading.com, and today I want to take you along with me and show you a couple different variations of bread recipes that I make regularly here on our homestead. So I want to start off with my regular sourdough artisan bread recipe. Now this is a staple here in my kitchen. I make this almost on a weekly basis, but it's actually pretty simple to make. It's just that it takes a lot of time. So to start, we just combine the all-purpose flour and the whole wheat flour. I have the exact recipe over on the blog and I'll link that below. And I just combine those really well with my hand. And then I go ahead and heat some water. I'll either just run it through my pitcher warm or measure it out into my tea kettle and heat it up that way. And then I will just stir the water and flour together with a wooden spoon to roughly combine it and let that set for about 30 minutes. This is called the autolyse step, and that is to allow the flour to fully absorb the water before adding the other ingredients. While that dough is resting for those 30 minutes, I'm going to move on to a different bread recipe that's maybe a little more unconventional, and that's because I am combining sourdough starter with active dry yeast. Now this is a recipe that I will use if I just don't have the 48 hours plus to wait on the sourdough bread. It's still fermented because I do have that sourdough starter in there and I do let it set. It just does not take nearly as long as the straight sourdough bread. So this is just a recipe that I like to have in my arsenal in case I need to get bread on the table much faster than I can with the straight sourdough recipe. So I start this one off kind of opposite of the other recipe, where I will measure out 3 cups of warm water into a large bowl and combine that with 1 tablespoon or 1 packet of active dry yeast, along with 3/4 cup of sourdough starter. This could be active or it could be discard, since we're more so relying on the yeast to leaven this bread. And then we'll whisk that together really well, and immediately after that we'll go ahead and stir in the flour. I like to use 5 cups of all-purpose flour and 1.5 cups of whole wheat flour. Then I'll also add in 2 tablespoons of salt and mix that really well with a wooden spoon and just let this set at room temperature. You could just let this set for as little as 2 to 3 hours, and that would be enough time for it to rise, but you're not really going to get the benefit of the fermented grains in that short amount of time. So I go for more about 6 hours at room temperature before transferring this to the fridge for at least a couple hours. So let's jump back to the sourdough bread here. To finish this dough, I go ahead and add in 200 grams of the sourdough starter. Now it does definitely need to be active for this recipe. And then I'll add in 20 grams of sea salt. And then I'll just combine that really well with my hands and let that set for about 20 or 30 minutes before I start the stretch and folds on this dough. I like to get in about 6 sets of stretch and folds where I just pull the dough up as tall as I can and then fold it over itself, and repeat that on the other 3 sides. You'll see that as you do this more and more, the dough will form a little more of a solid mass and not quite as wet as it was when you started working with it. After the stretch and folds, you're just going to leave it at room temperature on the counter to double in size. This has taken anywhere from about 10 to 20 hours for me, just depending on the heat in the kitchen. But once it's doubled, you can go ahead and shape the loaves by transferring it all to a well-floured surface and dividing in half. And then you're just going to take each of those halves and start to shape them into a large ball of dough, turning it away from you and then pulling it back towards you to create some tension in the loaf. And then we're just going to let it set on the counter for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then we will come back to get it in our Banneton baskets. After that waiting period is up, we're just going to flour some Banneton baskets, turn the loaf over, and tuck in all 4 sides to make sure everything is nice and tight. Then we'll just plop it into the Banneton basket, cover it with some plastic wrap, and transfer it to the fridge for another rise at a cooler temperature for about 12 hours before this is ready to bake. The yeast sourdough combination bread is a little less involved at this part, and it's ready to go at any point after it has chilled in the fridge. I've left it up to a couple days though before I bake it, and it's totally fine either way. I like to divide this amount of dough into 3 sections, and I'm going to go ahead and just transfer one section to the floured surface just like I did the other, and pull it away from me and then back towards me to create the tension just like the other loaves. And then I'm going to plop it into a Banneton and let it set at room temperature for about 30 minutes while I have a Dutch oven preheating at 425 for the same amount of time. Once it's preheated, we're just going to transfer the loaf to the Dutch oven on some parchment paper. It doesn't need scoring, and we're going to bake that for about 30 minutes. And then we're going to take the lid off after those 30 minutes and bake it at 475 for another 10 minutes. After that baking process is done, you want to just immediately remove it from the oven and transfer it to a plate or a cutting board and just let it set for about 30 minutes or so to cool down a little before slicing. And this one is ready to go. Now for the straight sourdough bread, I'll start by preheating the Dutch oven at 500 degrees for an hour, and then I'll transfer the loaf from the fridge to a piece of parchment paper and sprinkle with flour and go ahead and create my scoring pattern. Then I'll bake at 500 for 20 minutes and lower the temperature after that to 475 and bake for another 15 with the lid off. Then of course immediately transfer it from the Dutch oven and let it cool, and this loaf is done as well. Alright friends, that is all for today. If you try out these sourdough bread variations, be sure to let me know in the comments below and let me know which one you like better. And I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and I look forward to catching back up with you all whenever possible. Until then, happy baking and happy homesteading. See y'all later.